Welcome, Nashville software students. This is Steve Brownlee, lead instructor, and today I'm going to walk you through how to use callbacks in asynchronous programming. If you've gotten to this point, you've learned how to do XHRs, which is loading external resources, waiting for those to return, and using that data in some meaningful way. And now we're going to just simply take the concept in a little bit of a different direction. So let's look at a sample HTML file that I've put together here. Fairly simple. I've got some DOM elements, an article that contains two children's sections. One is called Carnivores List, one is Carnivores Grid, and I'm including one JavaScript file called Predators.js. Let's take a look at that JavaScript file. You should all be familiar with this concept at this point. This is an IFI. I'm creating a global variable called Predator, and I've got one private variable in there called private carnivores that I set to an empty array to begin with. And this IFI function, it returns an object. And this object has one key value pair on it. Key is load carnivores, and its value is a function. Let's take a look at what this function does. I've got some carnivores in here with some starter code. So the first thing I do is I create an XHR. I then add an event listener on it. Now remember, load is the event that gets broadcast when it is done loading the file from the file system. And when that is done, I'm telling it to execute this callback function. Okay, remember, this set of instructions that I'm passing on is the second argument to that event listener. That is called a callback function, saying, when you are done, execute this code. Now, I've just got some comments in there for now, and I'm going to fill that in a minute. But after I register my event listener, first thing I do is, or the next thing I do is say, what I want to do, I want to get, and what do I want to get? I want to get this carnivores JSON file. Just take a look at that real quick. Fairly simple. It's an object. It's got one key in it called carnivores. That itself is an array of objects. Different carnivores I came up with randomly and where they live. All right. And then I start the process with send. Okay, so that's going to go grab the file. So I've got this fired up in my browser. Right now, I'm not doing anything. I'm not console logging anything, so we don't see it. However, that code did run. So if I go look in my network tab, I'll see here's carnivores JSON. Okay, it's an XHR request, so that code did run. So now I'm going to still go start adding code in, and we can see how this flows one step at a time. All right, so the first thing I do in this callback function, I've got a comment here to set the value of the private array. So let's do that. There it is. Now remember, the property on the XHR that we want to look at is called response text. Okay? And it's going to be on the execution context, because the execution context, by the time we get here, what started this whole process? Well, the XHR started the process. When we said send, we're still on the execution context on that XHR request. So that's what this is. So this .response text simply is the raw string of characters in carnivores.json. Okay? It is not a JavaScript object yet. So to do that, if you remember, we parse it. We parse a string, and what that'll do is it'll convert that string of characters into an object. So let's save that. And of course, rule number one, console log everything. So let's just run this code real quick and we'll see what it does. Console. There we go. We have a private carnivores. That carnivores key, here's all three of those objects that I put on it. Cow and the species. Go back and look at the JSON file. You'll see it is. Starts off as an object. Curly brace does up there. One key value pair. It's the key. Its value is an array. Okay. Next, let's go ahead and take that data and let's start putting stuff in the DOM. So let's start off with the carnivores list. So let's store a reference. List is Alright, so I've got a reference to that DOM element. So now I want to loop over this private carnivore's data and actually start putting up a DOM string to put that in there. Current carnivore. Remember, that should be a good practice for you to begin with. Set the current carnivore. Alright, let's build up our DOM string. So out here, let's create a blank one. Output string. That's what we're going to build up. So we need to default it to an empty string. So let's just create h1 tag. The species. What is this going to be right here? I think I missed something. What I actually want to do is where do I sit? There it is. I actually want to look specifically at the carnivore's key on that. Set up. All right, so current carnivore species. Just copy that, and then I'm going to put an h3 tag with pretty simple string, right? And list.inner HTML equals output string. Let's see if that works. There we go. Jaguar, Asia, leopard, Africa, grizzly bear, and North America. Like the H1 and the H3 tags, pretty much the same size there. Weird. Couldn't be. We knock that down to like an H5 real quick. That's a little bit better. Okay. So it works. We read a JSON file, we convert it into a native JavaScript object here, then we loop over that object, build up a DOM string, and output it. You know, you've done that several times up to this point. However, let's talk about how flexible this code is, because right now what I've done is determine that you're going to learn and get comfortable with as we go through this course and as you go through your careers, which is called unnecessary coupling. And look at the name of the method that I put in here called load carnivores. Now, this method does more than one thing. It doesn't just load carnivores. It's loading it, but I'm also putting things in the DOM. It shouldn't be done here. To really create flexible code, you want to follow the single responsibility principle, which I've probably talked to you about that at this point, which is every function that you write should do one thing and one thing only. If you start putting multiple actions and multiple features inside of one function, as your product grows and becomes more complex, which is inevitable once you get out there in the field, it actually makes it harder for you to change the code. It requires a lot more time and effort from you if the project is already large to take that code it's already coupled and then decouple it and change your architecture. So let me show you an example real quick. Let's take the action of actually putting in the DOM and move it into a separate function completely. That isn't even part of Predator, okay? Because the Predator I just want to leave as the way to get data. So down here, I'm just going to create a function. Actually, call it list carnivores. I want to send the carnivores in here. So I'm going to accept an argument. If somebody calls list carnivores, they have to pass me the data. So in here, I'm just going to move all of this stuff down out of the load carnivores function inside of list carnivores. Now the code's a little bit more flexible. and a bit easier to understand. Each one of these functions does one thing, and it's easier to read because we don't have dozens of lines of code. Okay? So let's see if this works. List carnivores. So up here, when I load it, I parse the data, and then I'm just going to call list carnivores. I'm going to pass it the data. Okay. This is where I'm storing inside here. I want to send it down. Okay, so I'm going to take that data, and carnivores becomes private carnivore. Let's see if this still works. Probably not. Nope, private carnivores is not defined because I didn't change my variable. Down here. So I'm just going to do that. Okay, code still works. Now, the reason I got to this point is because I also have in my old HTML, I have a list, but I also want to display a grid. And this is what I'm going back and to go back and touch about making your code more flexible. What I want to do here is I want to just have the standard list that I showed you, just with H1 and H5 tags. I then want to go back with the same data, but displayed a little bit differently. Now, if I had coupled all of this together and in load carnivores up here, done all three of those actions, meaning load the data, list the data sequentially, and then build up a grid together, again, now we're looking at even more code inside this load carnivores. So it does even more than one thing. So if somebody else then comes in with a task, you have a teammate, at some point they want to have a table of carnivores. Again, they just want to write it in some other module to make the code more maintainable. But the thing is, if they write some other functions called table carnivores and they call load carnivores, well, load carnivores is not only doing one thing, it's doing all three things. That's why we're breaking this out. Every function we write should do one thing in code. Right. But we still have coupled this. Okay. In this loader, we still said specifically to list the carnivores. So it's still coupled. Even though I broke the code out, every time somebody calls load carnivores, list carnivores will get executed no matter what. I'm going to create another function here, show you how to get around this. Grid carnivores. It also is going to take the carnivores in as an argument. And it wants to do relatively the same thing, so I'm going to duplicate my code. Shift Command D, remember, move it down. I'm just going to customize this. Carnivores grid. And variable grid with places. And I've got a default CSS file that I created here. Here it is. I created a class called carnivores card. It's going to float things to the left and make the width 30, put a border around it, kind of a very basic kind of card style. So I'm going to add this carnivores card, or copy that. So instead of this H1, H5, I'm just going to create a div. For now, get rid of this. And give that div that style, or that class. With just the species. Okay. Now, since we had called list carnivores here, we also want to call grid carnivores. Again, we're going to pass the data in as an argument. So every time you load carnivores now, every time I call load carnivores, it's going to build the list and it's going to build the grid. Let's see if this works. It did not apply any of those styles. Let's take a look why real quick. Because I did not add in my CSS file. All right, and this was called l.css. There we go. Very simple cards. Nothing complex about them at all. Okay. Go back to the console. But I still got a problem here, don't I? Okay. Every time somebody wants to load carnivores, it's going to build the list and it's going to build the grid. What if I don't want to build the list and build the grid every time I call it? I'm building some of the piece of functionality completely. Like I said, I want to build a table out of them. I don't want a list or a grid. So we have to take this out of here. We have to decouple this functionality of listing and gridding out of the functionality of actually loading. So what you want to do is actually pass the functionality that you want to be performed to load carnivores and say, hey, load carnivores, when you're done loading, execute this code. Okay? So just like we did with the load event, remember? That functionality is kind of the same. You say, hey, XHR, go. And here you add an event list that said, when you're done, execute this code. You sent it a callback function. So we want to do the same for the load carnivores. Hey, load carnivores, when you're done, I want you to execute this bit of arbitrary code. It doesn't matter what's inside of it. That's my responsibility. I just want you to say, hey, you're done, and then execute this code. So let's send carnivores a function reference, a callback function. Okay. And then when it's all done loading it, rather than specifically saying what it wants to do and coupling this functionality, we're just going to say, hey, yeah, okay, I'll execute your code. And I'm going to pass you the data. So let's get rid of this. So now when we call load carnivores, we have to send it a function as an argument, saying specifically what we want to do. When it's all done, saying, okay, I'll execute it. So this changes list carnivores, grid carnivores. Okay? We now need to pass those function references in. Let's come back down here to load carnivores and we'll say, let's pass that function reference in. So now we're passing a function reference into load carnivores. Okay, JavaScript gets up here this first time through. That callback function equals list carnivores. That's the value of it. Value of callback function is this function right here. Okay, that's what it's storing. So when we execute it, we pass this in. It does its same old process. It creates the XHR. As the event listener, says what to get, starts the process. When it's all done, it executes our code that we want to be executed. Okay? It's much more dynamic and flexible this way. This way, we can pass any function in to be executed when we load code. So let's run that. Look at it. It still works. Okay? List carnivores was executed after the code was completed, because that's what callback function is at this point. So now we have a more flexible code base. Now we can say, hey, I want to load carnivores again, but this time I want to execute grid carnivores when you're all done loading the file. There's our grid again. So now we have a much more flexible code base. Now we're passing function references all over the place, and your code gets a little bit more complex. Okay, your brain has to keep things kind of in short-term memory a little bit differently. It's not just that procedural code of do this, do this. Okay? We've got this callback function, which says, okay, when you're done loading, execute this code. Inside that callback function, we're calling yet another callback function. Okay? So now we're 3 levels deep in our scope. We want to go back and look at that again. Okay? Here's this initial function for the iffy. Here's this inner function as part of load carnivore. Inside that, yet again, here's another anonymous function that gets fired when the load event is done. Remember, in JavaScript, you can look up, but you can't look down. Okay? So this callback function was actually created up here. Okay? So even though it's within this inner function, callback function looks to this one first, not defined here, looks up to this function, yep, defined here. Since its value is list carnivores. It executes list carnivores. We have our parentheses here. That means invoke it, send it to this data. So now let's take this to another level. What I was talking about, where you have a separate developer and a separate module wanting to execute this code. Here I have all of the relevant code in one single file, but you're rarely going to see that when you get into a complex application. These functions, grade carnivores and list carnivores, will be somewhere else. So I've got a JavaScript file over here. I'm calling it callbackheld.js. I'm going to take these. I've already got a show carnivores in here. So what I'm going to do, take list and grid and cut them out of here and paste them into here. So now this JavaScript file has 3 different functions that all look almost exactly the same. There's show carnivores, there's grade carnivores, and there's list carnivores. They all want to do something with the same data. Again, editor.load carnivores. Now I can call it 3 different ways. Show, kill, and list. Since load carnivores, all it does now is one thing and one thing only, which is load the data. We pass the actual set of instructions that we want to do with that data into it and say, simply execute my code. Load it and execute my code. I'm going to get rid of this here. All right, so now this Predator.js file truly is as simple as we can make it. It does one thing. Loads data and executes a bit of arbitrary code. Now in this file, we can start calling those separate things one at a time. So there's a little bit more about callbacks. Yeah, I was going to say carnivores. A little bit more about callbacks. We took it from a very simplistic implementation, and we broke it out. Hopefully that shows you how you can take function references and pass them around in all these different and interesting ways to actually make your code a little bit more flexible.